Okay, good afternoon and good evening to our international audience. We're so delighted to have you join us here today for a virtual conversation on writing modern Jewish history with Doctors Nancy Sinkoff and Natalia Aleksiun. My name is Avinoam Patt. I'm the Doris and Simon Conover Chair of Judaic Studies at the University of Connecticut, where I also serve as director of the Center for Judaic Studies and Contemporary Jewish Life. We're delighted to be able to host today's program with two wonderful friends and colleagues. It's really a mechaya to see everybody here together and to be able to engage in this conversation with both of you. This is a launch of an exciting semester of programs that we have here, virtual programs at the Center for Judaic Studies and Contemporary Jewish Life at the University of Connecticut. I would welcome everyone to visit our homepage and see our events listings for a series of programs that will be taking place via Zoom this semester. Today's program will be recorded, as you can tell, and we'll be posting it to our UConn Center for Judaic Studies YouTube page, and you can feel free to share the link with anyone who might also be interested in this program. A couple of notes about the format of the program before we begin. We're going to have a Q&A, a sort of moderated Q&A that I will moderate with our two speakers for about the first 40 minutes or so after introductions. And then we'll take questions from the audience. And I would ask you to please use the chat function at the bottom of your screen. Even as our speakers are speaking, you can begin to type in questions there that you want them to address. And then we'll leave plenty of time for a moderated Q&A at the end. So please use the chat function in order to do that. So it is my great pleasure to introduce our wonderful speakers today. As I do that, I'm going to share the flyers, the book flyers for these wonderful books. Dr. Natalia Aleksiun is the professor of modern Jewish history at Jewry College Graduate School. She is studied Polish and Jewish history at the Warsaw University, the Graduate School of Social Studies in Warsaw, and Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and at New York University. She received her doctorate from Warsaw University in 2001, and her dissertation won the Polish Prime Minister's Award for Doctoral Students and appeared in print as Where to? The Zionist Movement in Poland, 1944 to 1950 in Polish in 2002. In 2010, she received her second PhD from New York University based on her dissertation entitled Ammunition and the Struggle for National Rights, Jewish Historians in Poland Between the Two World Wars. She was co-editor of the 20th volume of Polin, devoted to the memory of the Holocaust. She has published in Yad Vashem Studies, Polish Review, Dapim, East European Jewish Affairs, Studies in Contemporary Jewry, Polin, Gal-Ed, East European Societies and Politics, and German History, among others. Together with Brian Horowitz, she's editor of volume 29 of Polin, titled Writing Jewish History. And among many prestigious fellowships, she has been a fellow at the Institute of Contemporary History in Munich and at the Wiesenthal Institute for Holocaust Studies in Vienna, as well as the Pearl Resnick Postdoctoral Fellow at the Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. Conscious History, Polish Jewish Historians Before the Holocaust, is being published by Littman Library later this year and will be available later this spring. I think at the end of March, if I'm not mistaken, you should be able to begin ordering copies. And I'm showing you here the lovely flyer for the book where there's also a discount courtesy of Liverpool University Press, Conscious 30. And we can think about what that means, Conscious 30. Okay, so welcome to Natalia. And then it's also my distinct pleasure to welcome Dr. Nancy Sinkoff. Dr. Sinkoff is the academic director of the Bildner Center for the Study of Jewish Life and professor of Jewish Studies and History at Rutgers in New Brunswick, New Jersey. From 2014 to 2016 and 2017 to 2018, she served as the director of the Center for European Studies at Rutgers. Dr. Sinkoff received her doctorate in modern Jewish history from Columbia University in 1996, after earning 2 master's degrees, one from Columbia in American history and one from the Jewish Theological Seminary of America in Interdisciplinary Jewish Studies. She holds a BA from Harvard Radcliffe College, where she graduated magna cum laude in social studies. Dr. Sinkoff's fields of interest include early modern and modern Jewish history, East European Jewish intellectual history, both in the Polish heartland and its diasporic settlements, the Enlightenment, politics, and gender, among other topics. Her biography of Lucy Davidovich, which you can see here in front of you from left to right, Lucy S. Davidovich, The New York Intellectuals and the Politics of Jewish History, was published in March of 2020 by Wayne State University Press, and as many of you know, was this year's recipient of the National Jewish Book Award in the category of biography. She is also at work on an introduction to the scientific edition of Mendel Leffin of Satanov's unpublished Yiddish translation of the Book of Job. Other recent publications include her co-edited volume, Sarah Levy's World, Gender, Judaism, and the Bach Tradition in Enlightenment Berlin, including an introductory essay, Experiencing Sarah Levy's World, and of course, her volume Out of the Shtetl, Making Jews Modern in the Polish Borderlands. She has published in the Journal of the History of Ideas, the Association of Jewish Studies Review, Studies in Contemporary Jewry, Jewish Quarterly Review, American Jewish History, among many other places. And of course, she consulted on the 18th century gallery Encounters with Modernity at Polin, the Museum of the History of the Jews of Poland in Warsaw. So wonderful to have both of you here. It's such a pleasure, such a delight. I'm going to stop my share for now. And I'm so excited to have both of you here for today's program. So I'm going to start this off with one of the reasons that we have both of you here speaking together, because your two books encompass the writing of Jewish history by East European Jews for much of the 20th century, albeit by historians in differing national contexts who took the role of historian and the political import of the writing of history very seriously. So why don't we start as a beginning with each of you explaining who are your main protagonists? How and why did you select them to be your topics of study? And why is it important that we today learn about these individuals or the historical schools they represent today in 2021? So Natalia, why don't you start us off answering that question?
Thank you so much, Dr. Patt, for this generous introduction. And I'll only add that the volume on historiography is out, and now I'm working on volume 36 on childhood, children, and child rearing. So if anybody in the audience is interested, please let me know. And also I became the editor-in-chief, co-editor-in-chief of East European Jewish Affairs. So do remember us when you have articles in the making or your students are writing fantastic papers. Now, my story is in some way autobiographical, which I only realized long after the manuscript was done, how much this was in a way going back to my own place of education, my own alma mater, Warsaw University History Department, which is where most of the historians belonging to my young cohort had studies. And this is a cohort that would have been very central to the writing of Jewish history, Eastern European Jewish history, and specifically Polish Jewish history, but they, for the most part, perished in the Holocaust. And they became a forgotten, emerging new school of thought, new methodological reflection with their sets of practices of writing, political engagements. And in case of some of them, I can't even tell you what happened to them. So here is my favorite, Sarah Eisenstein. I have her address when she was studying. And so she was living in Warsaw, Nowolipie, at the heart of the Jewish neighborhood. She was from Łódź. She wrote about Jewish women, a very passionate thesis. But I don't know what happened to her. She's not mentioned in any list of survivors. I have only her address before the war. And she's part of a larger cohort. You see here several pictures of women, because women are an important part of this cohort. This is what makes it so new and interesting. And most of the research that was written in the interwar Poland by these young women and men was not published. You see one of the few examples, a book by David Wurm, a local study on Jewish community in Brody, which is still being cited by scholars writing on Galicia. They are a cohort with new institutions, such as the Institute of Judaic Studies, and Warsaw is somewhat of a center for this group. I'm sure we'll talk with Nancy about the relationship, the conversation between Warsaw and Vilna in this respect, with journals that they set up, with ambitions that they have for their own research. And of that group, one person became much better known thanks to Sam Kasov's wonderful book, Who Will Write Our History, Emanuel Ringelblum. But he represents many more historians who were receiving their academic training at Polish universities for the most part, and who were entering both Polish academia and popular history as Jews, as Poles, as Polish Jewish historians. So just a glance on a map where Warsaw, with its university that became the center of training these young people, and other academic centers in the Second Polish Republic. But these young scholars that are at the heart of my book had teachers that were not less important. And in fact, much of this work is a conversation between a generation that emerges from Galicia, from Lvov, who have close connections, biographical connections, intellectual connections to history writing in Galicia before Poland reemerges from the First World War. Meyer Bałaban, Ignacy Itzhak Schipper, Moshe Moses Shor, and as you can see, all of them perish. Bałaban in the Warsaw Ghetto, Itzhak Ignacy Schipper in Majdanek, and Moshe Shor in a Soviet Union. And so this is a universe of conversations, networks, writings that I hope to bring back more to the attention of historians of Jewish Europe, Eastern European Jewish history, and more.
Thank you so much, Natalia. Nancy, why don't you, and I started introducing you as Drs. Aleksiun and Dr. Sinkoff, but I have to call you by your first names, so I apologize. But Nancy, why don't you tell us a little bit about sort of how you came to this topic, and why it's important for us to be learning about Lucy Davidovich today.
So first of all, thank you everyone for attending, and thank you, Avi, for inviting us. I can't imagine, I mean, a few of the people in our international audience who are out there, you too are part of this conversation of the writing of modern Jewish history and the modern East European Jewish history. So you're all part of what are my favorite conversations. I wrote a singular biography. Natalia's book is a collective biography and a generational biography. I wrote a singular biography, but also I did it, I focused on an American-born daughter of Polish Jews. So in many ways, she is the next generation in Natalia's story, if you will. And I don't think I fully understood that until I had the great fortune to work with Natalia and read her book, and to talk to her over many years about what her protagonists were doing. So Lucy S. Davidovich, born Lucy Schildkret, is an American Jewish immigrant daughter. Her parents are on the left of your screen. They come from Siedlce and also outside of another town outside of Warsaw. And she is raised as an American Jew and very much a New York Jew, goes to public schools, goes to prestigious high school. She's, again, when I think about Anna, your protagonist, Natalia, this is the same kind of young woman eager, vital, goes to college, engaged, smart as a whip. And that's who Lucy was. And she went to the Hunter College High School for Girls and then Hunter College, single sex. And she studies English literature. In that regard, it's somewhat different. We can talk more about it, but this kind of entryway for American Jews in the diaspora is through the English language and through literature. And I think the language question is critically important here for later conversations. And she is the editor of her magazine, and she's left wing. And that's part of my story. My book's title is From Left to Right. So the political journey of this American Jewish immigrant is central question that I was investigating. But Lucy is also educated as a Yiddishist in diaspora nationalist institutions, and particularly in something called the Shalom Lechem Folk Institute, where she attended not only its after-school supplementary elementary program, but also its Mittelschule and also its summer camp. And we shouldn't dismiss the significance of youth movements in the interwar period, what we know now as the interwar period, and the cultivation of ideology among diaspora nationalists, including in her case, Polish Jewish immigrants. So her mentors were individuals similar to the cohort of Scholl, Schippel, Mahler, and they included people like Leibisch Lehrer, and most importantly, Yaakov Shatsky. And he plays such an important role in Natalia Aleksiun's book, and such an important role in Lucy Davidovich, the person who becomes Lucy Davidovich's life, because it is Shatsky, her teacher and historian, who encouraged her to continue studying Jewish history, not literature, at the YIVO in Vilna. So in August 1938, this young American immigrant daughter decides to go to Europe backwards, right? The backwards migration pattern for most Jews. She goes from the North American territory, if you will, to Vilna, Poland. And here you have her in her cohort, fourth cohort of the Ascalon tour. These are the students have gotten some kind of fellowships to continue studying history, ethnography, philology at the Vilna YIVO. Natalia can talk more about the fact that the Vilna YIVO was less devoted, quote unquote, to the study of history than the mentors and university-trained historians at the University of Warsaw. Nonetheless, Lucy was engaged most in the study of history. And here you have her cohort, and of course, tragically and horrifyingly, only some of them survived the war. So again, this whole question of the rupture, not the intellectual rupture, but the physical annihilation of the Jews of Eastern Europe is a central issue here in who gets to write Jewish history. And I would also make a nod, and I know I'm going on and on, but I can't help it, is that, Polish history itself was interrupted. The writing of Polish history was interrupted because of the partitions. So this is a long story of a modern gap in the writing of Polish history and then the writing of Polish Jewish history. So Natalia's protagonists in Galicia are so important because they are writing in the condition of partition and writing about the Polish Jewish past. Lucy is a different story. She goes to Vilna, as I said, and then this is, again, because one can't help but show archival material because we're archival historians. This is a list of the aspirantur of what their subject matter was in Yiddish, and of course, Lucy's she was writing about the Yiddish press in England. And then, whoops, I'm going backwards. I apologize for that. That's my technological skills. When she left Poland in late August 1939, she got out because of her American passport. And she ended up working at the Skeletal YIVO, the American branch, the Amaptel, with Max Weinreich and other refugee scholars who'd gotten out. Mahler, interestingly, Raphael Mahler was in the United States and gets stuck in the United States, which is a fascinating problem for him, and others. And here you see her contribution to YIVO Blätter of the outline of the Warsaw Ghetto, which gives you a sense of the intimacy of the connection to Eastern Europe on the part of the YIVO scholars, this refugee group, which included other people, we can mention them later, and her own intimacy. And then she returns to Europe. So she makes another trip back to Europe, and now it's Europe after, right? It's Europe after. It's post-genocidal, post-Holocaust, and she goes to the quote unquote land of Amalek. She goes to post-war Germany, works in both the American and British zones, is there for 15 months, is instrumental in helping There's survivor historians who literally emerged out of the rubble or out of hiding, including Philip Friedman and others, Israel Kaplan, to begin to write the history of the genocide. And so this is their journal from Lexington Holman, and she helps them get the Yiddish linotypes. And she also, when she works for the Joint Distribution Committee, which was her shingle, if you will, she helped catalog the remainder of the books, or at least not the one level of remainder of the books, because we know there were still other materials now in Vilnius, but she helped catalog the materials that were plundered and stolen by the German professoriate and salvaged in the OAD, the Offenbach Archival Depot. And these were shipped to New York in July of 1947, a story that has been told wonderfully by Elizabeth Galwas and others. And again, this is the Lucy Davidovich's European experience. The last slide I'll show right now is that the first work she had before she became, quote, an American and worked for the American Jewish Committee was doing Yiddish translations for John Hersey. John Hersey's book, The Wall, is the fourth best-selling book of 1950. It was that important. A film was made of it. Hersey himself was a correspondent in Moscow, and he employed Lucy S. Davidovich and Mark Novogrodsky, the son of a Bundist who had gotten out through Vilna. He employed them to translate both from Yiddish and Polish so he could write this book. So I just want to close this little section with underscoring the fact that Lucy S. Davidovich is an American link to the historiography of East European Jewry, and it's a link that is penned or voiced in English to the North American diaspora. So that is, and to the North American public. So that makes her generationally after, and also linguistically and regionally out of or beyond the heartland of East European Jewry. So I think that's why I chose my subject. I think I answered your question.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Nancy. So I'm gonna just sort of put us together on the screen here around the same place. I wanna, one of the things that sort of both of you allude to, I guess both implicitly, explicitly, is sort of how important the role of the historian and frankly the biography of the historian is in the writing of Jewish history in this case. Nancy, in your book, you write that Lucy Davidovich argued that Jewish history, and here I'm quoting, must be written with Ahavat Yisrael or Ahavas Yisrael, love of the Jews. And I want to ask you sort of what that meant to her. And in a similar vein, Natalia, as you write in your introduction, and I'm going to quote a little excerpt from your introduction, you write, "This book engages with a question raised by historian Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi and Zachor, Jewish history and Jewish memory, probing within the Polish context his idea that in modern times a secularizing and consciously Jewish intelligentsia takes on history writing as a profoundly Jewish act," end quote. So I want to ask both of you, to what extent is it possible to separate out the historian from the writing of the history, or for that matter, the Jewish historian from the writing of Jewish history? Or if we think about it, you know, the languages, which you alluded to in your introductory remarks, the languages in which Jewish historians write. Nancy, you have a wonderful play on words with your title, from right to left or left to right, right? And we think of it politically, but it also has meaning linguistically if you write in Polish, Yiddish, Hebrew, or English. So all of these choices have political and religious implications. So maybe Nancy,
we have the evening. We have the whole evening, right, for this great.
100%. we can go on forever. So Nancy, maybe you could start telling us a little bit about sort of the role that the individual biography plays and the motives of writing this history play, and sort of how Jewish history is written. And then Natalia, will let you add on to that.
So I think Natalia's quip is apt, you know, and Avi, you kind of corrected yourself. So or not corrected, you sort of focused on Jewish historians writing Jewish history, but you started by saying about writing history. So I do want to go back to your first little comment, this question of the subjective motivation of writing history, the purpose, the goal, the mission, versus the standards of, quote, objective historical writing. This is a problem for all intellectuals and for all historians, I'd say in particular, because unlike other fields which contribute much to the humanities, and I would never diss them, we historians still believe there's a there, right? We still believe in a selective objectivity. We believe that we can tell the truth after we compile vast amounts of materials, that our interpretations are based in reality. And I know this sounds terribly political right now, but I mean that seriously. And this crisis, or the perception of the crisis of history writing in the so-called postmodern moment, is a question that has informed the writing for all historians. So I just want to just say that. And I think one of the ironies, and we can talk more about this, and I'd love to, is in our very, very particular contemporary moment, there's been in many ways an abandonment of any pretext of objectivity in many fields. And yet in the writing of Jewish history, there's still the inheritance of the German Wissenschaft, the idea that there's an objective standard, that you distance yourself subjectively, and that any crossover is somehow less than. That historians of the Jews who have Jewish sympathies, whatever those might be, should make sure to distance themselves, right? And turn themselves into pretzels to say that they don't have, quote, a stake. And again, this is echoing, David Myers has recently written a short book called The Stakes of Jewish History, which is in many ways his homage to his teacher, Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi, who was also my teacher. The last subhead of my book is Zachor. So all of these questions, I just want to emphasize, affect the writing of history generally, and then affect the writing of Jewish history. And in terms of Lucy S. Davidovich, to get back to my protagonist, she was unapologetic about her view that Jewish history could be written from a perspective of commitment, of national commitment. Remember, she's a diaspora nationalist. She believes in this inchoate concept of Jewish peoplehood. She believes that that is the goal of writing history. And to my mind, she is the link to the Dubnovian or to Natalia Aleksiun's Galician historians, to the idea that there is some kind of collective communal mission in the writing of history. And she believes that you do that when you write from the experience of the Jews themselves. So again, she was prescient, and Ringelblum was prescient, and Natalia's cohort are prescient, because they are writing social history. They are writing from the voices of the so-called disenfranchised, or the so-called, not famous. And she believed that, particularly vis-a-vis the Holocaust, you had to tell the story of how Jews lived, the Jews themselves lived, and you had therefore to have access to their writings in the variety of languages in which they wrote. And she was unapologetic about this commitment, but she struggled with it. So I do have to say that when she wrote her book, The Holocaust and the Historians, about historiography, each chapter goes after, in many ways, a national history. And she underscores the problems with those, England, France, Poland, Soviet Union, the problems of the way in which those historiographies are biased vis-a-vis the writing about the Holocaust. And she's attempting to create a standard of what, quote, objective history is. And one of her more sophisticated or discerning critics, Barry Katz, actually writes her a personal letter and says, you are protesting too much because the power of your writing Jewish history comes from your subjective engagement with it. And she writes back to him and she says, you feel the thin ice, or you see the thin ice. And I just wanted to read to you what she wrote from her letter to him, which is in the appendix of my book. So it gives me the opportunity to tell everyone out there that there are 31 unpublished archival letters in my book, which are really the pride of my book for me. So I hope you'll read them because they're They give you a sense of her inner voice. But this is what she wrote to Barry Katz in 1983 after he reviewed her book and pointed out the problem of trying to separate the subjective from the objective in writing history, and in writing Jewish history in particular. She said, "I think that you hit precisely on the weakness in the book, at least what I regard as its most serious weakness. In the course of writing, I soon came to realize that this book was at bottom an attack upon history as a discipline. If history is indeed subject to the personal biases of historians, their cultural warps and predispositions, if history can be and has been manipulated by governments and movements in their own interests, which are not compatible with the goal of describing the past as it really was, then history is indeed a feeble undertaking whose pretension to recreate the past is little more than pretension, and that perhaps the whole historical enterprise has arrogated to itself unwarranted claims. In short, history cannot ever be scientific," unquote. So there you see the tension for her. I will just go back to your first phrase about Ahavat Yisrael or Ahavat Israel.
And then I want to give Natalia a chance to.
I know, I'm sorry. She did not apologize, and the central concept here is empathy for the Jewish experience in historical time.
Thank you. And I will add that the appendix is sort of a wonderful addition to the volume where we can actually dig in and see. She was a great letter writer. Maybe we have to archive our emails between each other. So Natalia, to this point, sort of, what do you see as the role of the individual biography of your protagonists as forming a school? Are they sort of articulating this political viewpoint that in the writing of this history?
Well, I think there is a lot of connections to what Nancy was saying, but I want to go back to Nancy, your keyword in your previous statement, presenting to us the general story of the book, which is intimacy, and for I think, for my historians, for sure, but arguably, I think increasingly for all of us writing Jewish history, some degree of connection that I think is becoming more and more okay to reveal, and a lot of new books on Jewish history are in some ways family histories, in ways that I think was not done when I was at least in my first graduate school. But this intimacy has several layers. So on the one hand, many of these historians are writing about their own communities. The one book that was in the image that I showed you earlier, David Wurm's Communal History of Brody, he was from there, he lived there, and he in fact died there. He taught in a high school in Brody and was murdered in the summer of 1941. So he knew people who were holding the sources. He knew people who had access to Pinkasim. And that kind of writing from the inside, it's not just often writing as a Polish Jew about the history of Polish Jews. It's writing about your community, which I must say, we can imagine ways in which it had their own political limitations, implications for the writing. And then there is the political aspect, which is writing as Polish Jews, which for my historians very much meant inscribing Jewish history into Polish history. And Nancy mentioned partitions, and indeed, from 1918, there is this great sense of urgency among historians in general of catching up. Right, there were all these states, France and Germany, they had their institutions and they were investing in historical science, and we need to catch up with this. Now, Jewish historians are part of it, but they have an extra mission, an extra urge, which is to make sure that the Jews are not skipped. in this catching up, and that they are described in a way that, again, they see as objective. We may engage with the question of apologetica, to what extent they want to make sure that in Polish books of history, we learn about the contribution, right? We learn about wonderful things that the Jews did for Polish commerce, or for developments of towns, or for diplomacy, and not least of all, fighting in various uprisings of the 19th century into First World War. And again, this seems like distant history, but this is during the time when the last uprising of 1863 is celebrated with very old men who were participating in this uprising, receiving medals and honors. And so this urgency to inscribe Jews and to make sure that they are present, but that also they are present as part of Poland and not as tolerated guests, turns this history into profoundly personal and written, again, going back, Nancy, to your lack of apologetica. Yes, there is a sense of tension, between this imagined objective history, but at the same time, very clear sense that the Jewish historians have a role to play. And this is not by accident that Raphael Mahler calls his collection of essays historians and guides, Wegweiser, right? Historians are much more than diggers of dusted documents. And Jakub Szacki, whom you mentioned earlier, when he writes in 47 about historians, he talks about them as bearers of ammunition in a struggle for Jewish rights. And so, no, there isn't a sense of apologizing, though there is a sense, I believe, of ongoing struggle, intellectual struggle for historians as they do engage in their research.
Avi, can I just add to that? So I think we agree on this. I think there's a tension in the word apologetics and so when I said that Lucy Davidovich doesn't apologize, for her, Jewish history has dignity and legitimacy regardless. That's what I'm saying. She's not apologizing, but is there an element of apologetics? Yes, and I'm not sure. I think what's so fascinating is that the language question and the location question matters. Your historians, your incredible historians, are trying to enter to make sure that the Jewish existence, the Jewish presence in Poland, 1,000 years of Jewish history, is noted in Polish by Polish readers, right? Even though many of them wrote in Yiddish too, and in other languages, but the making sure they are not left out, as you said, both contribution to the Polish state and everything we know. Davidovich is writing in a completely different context. And she's not writing about American Jewish history exactly. So it's a different set of issues, but they're related.
Yeah, and definitely the sort of the context within which they're writing. I mean, it's, we're sort of debating the objectivity, subjectivity, and can we separate it out? But clearly there is a context, and clearly there are sort of political motivations either at play in their own work or in the way that it's interpreted. Natalia, did you want to?
I want to a quick anecdote that I think is very telling, which is one review of Emanuel Ringelblum's book on Jewish participation in Kościuszko insurrection. And in the review, the author says, I have a feeling that the author Ringelblum is trying too hard to stress Jewish participation a little too much. And this is not a Polish historian with a Polish non-Jewish historian with a skeptical eye, but rather a fellow Jewish historian who understands that tension, that ongoing tension of how you write and how far you take that that sense of a need for things to be said publicly, also for Jewish audience. This is writing in Polish, also for Jewish audience, for them to understand where they come from.
Can I just add something? I know, Avi, you have other questions. No, but I keep thinking about also the tension and complexity of this, the success of it. So if Natalia's, and again, I think they're mine too, but my historians who lived in Natalia's book.
You can have them a little bit.
Okay, thank you. I have them through you. I'm very grateful. If they were successful, if you will, of emphasizing the Jewry, the presence of Jews in the long history of Poland, and particularly in certain areas, literally economic areas, and in the region, right? So the economic role that Jews played, and we know this about the Jewish economy, and the particular relationship of Jews to the Polish nobility in the Eastern borderlands. So here's the problem, is that those categories of, quote, Jewish participation or Jewish embeddedness have their own political problems, right? At times, this is a good thing to be central to the economy of Poland. But in other times, depending on how you view that economy, is it the feudal economy or the mercantilist economy? If the context is that that's, quote, a bad thing because it oppressed the peasants or kept them drunk or it colonized Ukraine,
you dominate.
Right. So the difference between settling Ukraine and occupying Ukraine, depending on the moment. So I think that is also one of the, I keep thinking it's like always a two-edged sword, because the Jews they are a part of Poland and they're apart from. And depending upon the winds of politics, and the writing of history is political, so I'm sort of nodding to one of our questions. The ways in which, because I've thought about this, Natalia, so much, because once many years ago, I had the great fortune of going to Kazan, Russia, to give lectures on Jewish history in Eastern Europe, and I was emphasizing the centrality of the Jewish role in the economy. And my interlocutor said, in today's Russia, that's actually a problematic category, emphasizing the Jewish role in the economy. And it was sort of like, oh, right, oh, I forgot that or something. So I think that there's always, and we can see that, by the way, in other aspects of Jewish historical writing, not only in Eastern Europe, but the enduring significance of Jews in Eastern Europe, even now in a post-genocidal moment, means that these topics continue to be renewed and discussed. And I don't think I need to tell this audience about
Avi, one sentence, because we knew that this was going to happen. One sentence, and I think that, Nancy, what you say is extremely important, how much these tensions and these impossible conundra of how do you write when you're aware of the stereotypes that surround the topic, that they are so much a matter of continuity. And one thing that is super central to including contemporary discussions about the place of the Jews in the past in Eastern Europe, in Poland, is this question of separateness. And my historians were also, on the one hand, stressing how embedded Jews were, how much they were part of, and they were drinking, and they were engaging in conversations and more. But at the same time, they had their own institutions, their own cultural, their own heritage. And this is also, in a way, an extremely political dance of not just intellectual question. They know it very well. This was more than one sentence, but I'm not saying anything more until the question.
No, it's great. And this is exactly what we wanted, a lively discussion about historiography. So there are some excellent questions that are already coming into the chat, and I want to pivot to those in a moment. Questions both about gender, which we want to talk about, and also about sort of the politics or the perceived politics of your protagonists. If we can say that 5 times fast, how that influences the way in which we interpret it. But there's one question that I want to get to before we get to those, and it has to do, obviously, with the Holocaust looms large over all of this, right? Clearly, because first of all, Lucy Dawidowicz's arguably most well-known work focuses on the war against the Jews, And because, Natalia, in the case of your protagonists, the outbreak of World War II interrupts the projects that they're undertaking of writing Polish Jewish history. And in many cases, despite, like you pointed to, Ringelblum's work under the occupation and sort of the historical projects that continue, it destroys their lives, literally destroys the project, destroys their lives. So can you reflect, this again, big question, but just reflect on the impact of the destruction of European Jewry for in both cases on, Natalia, maybe you go first. In your case, what it's done to kind of diminish the legacy or the recognition of the legacy of the school that you're talking about, Polish Jewish historians. And then Nancy, obviously, sort of the impact that it has on Lucy Davidovich and her work. But Natalia, you go first. Yeah.
This is, of course, a great question. And again, I wish we had a series for each of those. But you're right. I mean, this is a destruction of scholars, of libraries, of archives, of collections of letters, and of the audience. And all of them, those that did survive, like Czacki or Mahler, who left Poland before the war, or those who did survive the Holocaust, like Philip Friedman, they are very aware of the dramatic shift. And so in a way, I think that there is a shift, conscious shift, that they make from writing about, Haskalah and Jewish trade and various cultural institutions, Jewish theater, etc. They shift that intellectual energy into studying the Holocaust. So if you look at many of the people connected to creating the pioneering work on the Holocaust, Philip Friedman is the prime example, but also Arthur Eisenbach, also Jakub Kermisch, they shift their attention. And speaking about archives, I found one letter from Eisenbach to Friedman, sent to him from Warsaw to New York, where Eisenbach says, I'm finishing this collection of documents on the Nazi crimes, and I'm hoping that after that, I can go back to writing about Enlightenment. And for me, this was like an eye-opener into the fact that they remained committed to that dream of writing about Polish Jewish history, but that had to give to the need of documenting the Holocaust for many of them. And then there were various attempts of taking on the project that was so dramatically and brutally interrupted. But I'll pass the mic to Nancy. Not that I want to, but I will.
Yeah.
So
thank you, Natalia. Go ahead, Nancy.
So again, same thing, too much, not enough time. So just vis-a-vis the letter from Eisenbach to Kermisch, right? Lucy Davidovich also did that. She also said, I just want to be liberated from this topic. And she hoped that she would write a major work on American Jewish history. So there you have the same thing, that this desire to not only narrate Jewish death. Now, in her case, it's different from our historians, is that she was very much saw herself as the voice of a destroyed civilization. That is, and unlike in contrast to your historians, she really believed that the Jews were separate they were of Poland, but they were separate. They had a distinct magisterial civilization. They had a different set of time. They had different traditions and texts. She had very little sympathy for Gentile Poles. And I could go on and on about that. And it made her very different than others, right? She was unsympathetic and very early was willing to point the finger, if you will, at collaboration and complicity in the crimes against the Jews by Polish locals and Ukrainian locals, etc. But she is singed by the Holocaust. And I'm going to try and quickly show the dedications to her books, so you can see how fundamental it was to her own mission. So let me just try and do this very quickly, because it's a very evocative, I think. So here you go. These are the major works on the Holocaust. and you can see that these are objective studies and yet commemorative to a destroyed civilization. The golden tradition to Zelig and Riva Kalmanovich, her incredibly important surrogate parents in Vilna. The war against the Jews to her husband's murdered children, including his daughter Tokja Davidovich, who fought in the ghetto uprising and couldn't get out of the sewers. A Holocaust Reader, a very important documentary. Citation from Kalmanovich's incredibly important ghetto diary. The Jewish presence to her husband, and then her work on historiography. And I just, in this context, Natalia, right now, it's like it's just really emotional, I have to tell you. I've read this a million times, but the Holocaust and the historians in memory of the murdered Jewish historians, Dubnov, Balaban, there should be a diacritic there, Schipper and Ringelblum. And then, of course, her magisterial memoir, where she, to the murdered Jews of Vilna, and citing Ele Eskara, the religious prayer for commemoration. So for her, writing about the culture that was destroyed is her mission. And I want to be very clear here. She's not writing about the triumph of the survivors, which becomes so central to many American and Israeli historiographic interventions into the events of the past, which is Am Yisrael Chai. For her, der Jüdische Volk lebt und überlebt, but it was destroyed. The European epic is destroyed. And so her mission is to commemorate this 1,000 years, what happened, and to remind people of this singular war against the Jews, right? Not a universal message of humanity's evil against other people, but the German deliberate, intentional attack upon the Jewish heart and soul of Europe. That's absolutely central to who she is.
Well, there's so much to sort of analyze there, and it really is quite moving to see those dedications also, and to see sort of this direct link between essentially the School of Polish Jewish History that Natalia is writing about, and dedicating the work of the Holocaust and the historians to that lost school, right? To making sure that we understand that the work that was lost also, and a whole
but
school
it points
of history
also
that's
to what Nancy was saying before, how she sees herself really as continuing that path. It's a brilliant example.
Absolutely.
I wanted to say, I know I'm not supposed to do this, but the one thing we haven't mentioned, and we all know this, is we also have to remember not only were Natalia, our historians, murdered, their lives disrupted, archives destroyed, material culture collected and plundered, their audience was destroyed, and also in the post-war years, 1945 plus, Poland is under Soviet domination. And then, so the historians' narratives, what they can and cannot write about Jews, about Polishness, that is another reason or a complexity of what you're nodding, but it also affects, and Lucy also, what people have access to, archives. Go ahead, Natalia. It'd be good to disagree. Go ahead.
I'm nervously looking at the great questions and the time at the same time, but I agree and I disagree. Now, I would just say that, and you alluded to it and I alluded to it, there is definitely a shift in the interwar years in how receptive Polish academia and Polish historiography and Polish public discourse is to that account of Jewish belonging and Jewish presence in Poland as part of Poland. And we can talk about it, how much this is a change from early 20th century Galician intellectual context to Congress Poland, Warsaw, but there is a generational shift as well. And although my historians are not fully marginalized, that space of inclusion is shrinking. And my sense would be that the way of writing about Jews or not writing about Jews in Communist Poland until '89 is not, at least not mainly, or certainly not only, a function of Soviet domination, but this is the part in which Polish communist culture is to some extent continuing the traditions of national democracy, of the Endek party. This has been shown for Gomułka, and this is again for a whole different afternoon. But I just need to ever so gently protest against blaming that marginalization or silencing of Jewish history on the Soviet bloc in general.
No, I think it's fascinating, right, for us to look at. There's sort of an assumption of rupture, but right, with the war. But as you're pointing out, we have these important continuities that sort of carry through the war period and then are then continued in the construction of a national identity that may or may not include Jews and Jewish history.
And it's connected to languages, just thinking aloud, the things that are being published in the 50s and 60s, early 60s in Yiddish by the Jewish Historical Institute were published for a very, very small internal consumption, but they continue to be published, and they wouldn't be published in Polish to the outside audience.
All right, I want to make sure that we get to some of the questions in the chat, and we'll sort of go at least 15 minutes to make sure that we have time for the Q&A that's coming in. So I'm going to group a couple of them together, if you won't mind, that have to do with one from Louise, who asks about Natalia, was the fact that your female historians were never published only due to the Holocaust, or was there also a gender bias at work? And a follow-up question on that, which also asks more broadly on the central research area of the female Jewish historians who studied in Warsaw between the two wars, right? So those two sort of go together. And so maybe we'll start with that for Natalia, but I also had a similar question for Nancy, because I think, there is this big question about sort of how gender plays a role in both the way in which the Lucy, writes her history, but then also is received and trying to be sort of included. And you have a picture in there of like Lucy and all these male Jewish historians, right? So there is something going on there, and you make an argument about her reception as compared to Hannah Arendt, which I think is very interesting. So Natalia, why don't you start by telling us a little bit about the female historians, and then Nancy, tell us about gender and how it affects. Yeah.
Thank you, Avi, and thank you, Louisa, for this great question, and I'm waving. But I also could show you a picture. I won't waste precious seconds on connecting PowerPoint, but there is a picture taken from Jewish Press, very bad quality, of a session on Jewish history that is part of the International Congress of Historical Studies taking place in Warsaw in 1932, and it's all men. And you can see now there is Mahler, there is Friedman, there is Bałaban, there are all these wonderful guys. But this is a generation, a certain generation or two generations, you can argue, but there is a whole cohort of young women, and I don't think that the challenge to publishing their work is gendered. It has more to do with extreme difficulties of humanities in general, and I think we can experience some of this phenomenon of shrinking budgets, etc. And I found, for example, letters in which people write to each other, well, the only person right now who has a chance in the late 30s to have his books published is Meyer Bałaban, because he's just sufficiently known. He will get subsidies from Bnei Brit, from Jewish community in Kraków. He will find a way, but the younger people just don't have the same kind of opportunity. So this is more a question of difficulty in the context of Great Depression, and yes, also Jews. But if you look at the Junge Historiker and the Blätter für Geschichte published by the informal group of Jewish historians, some 1/3 of whom were women in Warsaw, you have multiple publications by women, especially Bela Mandelsberg-Schildkraut, who was among the founders. As to the subjects, this is a great question, but it has to do with how academia worked and still works with some professors, which is you got your topics from your professor. you didn't really choose what you wrote about. So I wouldn't necessarily tie when you look at what women wrote about with their actual interests, but they write social history and economic history. The Sarah Eisenstein is as an exception. She writes specifically about social and everyday life of Jewish women in early modern Poland, and complains that there should be more work done on the topic. Nancy.
So this is, you know, Lucy Schildkrit Davidovich is a different case. The American context is important. First of all, she studies English. As we noted, she only gets her master's in history in 1961. She writes her master's thesis at Columbia. She's working at the American Jewish Committee, and she chooses a topic. The focus is on Louis Marshall, who was one of the first presidents in the American Jewish Committee, and his support of a Yiddish newspaper on the Lower East Side, which Marshall did this as a way of diffusing the radicalism of the Lower East Side. So here you see it's the political question, why she chose this topic. She's working at this foremost defense agency. She's come there as a secretary. She starts to write book reviews and then slowly works her way up in the research division until she's the head. But it took 2 decades. She's not a public intellectual at this point. She's not a student really of history, although she writes this master's, again, under the tutelage to some degree of Sela Baron, whose name somehow, amazingly, didn't get mentioned yet. But there's Sela Baron, who is a Tarnov-born historian, a Galician Jew, 3 PhDs, University of Vienna, comes to the United States in 1920 and becomes, of course, the progenitor of many, many generations of Jewish scholars. So it's interesting that Lucy worked with him, but she doesn't have a doctorate. And this is a particular moment mid-century where there are other figures. Many of the male New York intellectuals don't have doctorates either, but they're men, and they have a public status, and they can be editors of journals, and there is the gendered expectation that they are working what we would say outside the home, right? I mean, and their quote amateur status, if you will, is not contested. She enters and it is contested, and I would say that's deeply gendered. The idea that somehow, you know, Natalia and I have talked about this, or Avi, I think you were in this conversation, you know, what's the difference between an amateur and an autodidact, right? If you're an autodidact, that's grandiose.
Dubnov is an autodidact.
Right. No one would call, right? But Lucy Davidovich is an amateur. So, and that's, I said, deeply gendered, but also her status as a quote historian is only garnered after she publishes The Golden Tradition and the War Against the Jews. She's already in her 60s. So the social setting of gender affects her deeply in terms of subject matter, in terms of cohort. Those things do not interest her. She's not a feminist. She's not interested in her mind in the special pleading of women, but she does include women in the Golden Tradition. So she's fully aware of women's creativity. She, and Nomi Seidman will tell you this too, she's one of the first persons to translate Vengerov, you know, into English in the Golden Tradition, and other, I think Sarah Schneer is in there too. So in that regard, she's not insensitive to women's experience, but it's certainly not foregrounded. And she is often the only woman in the room. And I'll just say that she knew there was a gender problem, but she wanted to be taken seriously by the men. She wanted to play in their court, and she did not want any special dispensation for her femaleness. I don't know really, we could go into our ends, but I think it'll take us far afield if there are other questions. I'm happy to talk about it, but I think I'll stop there.
And if I can plead that we at some point before the end go back to the question that you raised about politics, because
we can do it right now, and I'll actually I'll try to combine that with 2 of the questions that have come in the chat, which also deal with the politics, because there's a really interesting question from Michael Nutkiewicz, who asks, so on the one hand, the Jewish historians wrote for a contemporary audience with their lenses of comprehension through which they understood their historical moment. And to the sort of political component that we were talking about before, right? Like it matters if you understand and write that history with a Zionist or assimilationist or a Bundist or diaspora nationalist, whatever sort of political lens you want to ascribe to it. But as Michael points out, when we read those works today, we're reading it with an entirely different lens, right? So how do we sort of navigate both that interaction of the intent at the time, the way in which we interpret it today, and do we lose something essential, he asks, in terms of the intent and comprehension of these works written decades before? And I'll just add that there's an interesting question about Lucy Dawidowicz's, that Rivka Weisberg asks about Lucy Dawidowicz's political evolution that we could fold into this too, right? Like, how does her changing politics, which you sort of describe as from left to right, perhaps influence the lens through which she writes her history and maybe through which we interpret it? Who wants to start? Natalia, you want to start?
I'll go first, because there's a specific question to Nancy. And hi, Michael. In a way, I want to use it to use this very great question to nuance a little bit what Sinkoff did in his fantastic book, which is the chapter on the disciples of Borochov. And on the one hand, as he shows beautifully and compellingly, you cannot read Ringelblum without understanding of the importance of his Coalition links allegiance, because this is so much something that permeates his life and his intellectual life and his understanding of history before and during the Holocaust. If we were to especially read his notes on Polish-Jewish relations written in hiding. But at the same time, if we look closely at this cohort of historians coming to Warsaw from all kinds of places, although not from New York, they have a variety of political allegiances. So Nancy, you mentioned Naomi Zeidman, right? One of the students of Meyer Bauerban is Hillel Zeidman. So you have people that, he's a young star of rising star of Aguda, and you have Coalition left, and you have people who shift from Bundism to communism. You have a whole spectrum. And on the one hand, politics is immensely important for Jewish culture in interwar Poland, as many scholars had written about it, and youth movements and this kind of coming of age into politics and through politics. But my argument is that in a way, history project, writing history is a project that is a unifying project in which people with very different political views come together. So while it's interesting to know, back to specifically to Michael, to your question, while I think it's interesting to know where the authors of work that we might write, where they were coming from politically, we can't even always know. And I think that there is something to be said about reading these works collectively and not tied necessarily to Borochov, for example, but rather to a broader intellectual project of history.
So to address the question, I would say that all of us who read secondary sources on earlier periods, we need to be sensitive to their moment. And that's what the field of historiography is. So, I'm thinking of David Meyer's book on the Zionist school. I mean, you can't understand a Shalom and what he's trying to do, or a Dinor, what he was trying to do, unless you understand the ideological commitments they had in their moment. So I think a sensitive reader, well, we always lose things, but a good reader will be cognizant of the cultural moment in which those historians wrote, because none of us can step out of none of us can step out of our present, and the past is always present. So I would just say, I'm less worried about that question if one's a good reader. And when you read a Shatsky or you read a Raphael Mahler, I mean, their commitment to materialism has to do with a certain ideology, a certain commitment to Marxism. That's fine. Or a Wiener, thinking about Misha Kurtkov's work on Wiener. So I don't think that's a problem. And then you sensitively describe what they're trying to do. About Lucy Davidovich, there's a lot to say about politics. I'll mention just, I guess, two issues, which is that her study of the long Jewish past convinced her that radicalism and militancy was not, if you will, the tradition of Jewish political strategy, right? As opposed to those Americans who, for all kinds of reasons, date Jewish political behavior to Roosevelt and think that you're a liberal, you're a Democrat, that's a Jewish value. She came to the conclusion that by reading the longue durée of the Jewish experience, that Dina, what I say, Dina di Malchuta Dina, the Royal Alliance, having a sense of who holds the power in a society that Jews have often aligned themselves for good reason. So she was not apologetic about the fact that aligning with the state at different moments was the right position. So in that regard, her view of how she wrote about Jewish history was informed by that political interpretation of hers. But there's another, I want to sort of mention an article of hers that only appears published here. So, I think my screen is going to blow this. You can't see it, but this is the posthumous volume entitled "What is the Use of Jewish History?" which is based on an essay that she began to write already in the 70s. In this volume is a wonderful essay on Jewish economic history, and it's called Notes in Progress. And there you see Lucy Davidovich sort of épatée, the linke to mixed languages, saying enough already with the Jewish labor movement, although she wrote a great article on the Jewish labor movement, which was published first in Hebrew in Amot. That's interesting too. But she said enough already with focusing on the Jewish proletariat and the Jewish working class, as if that's the only way to write Jewish history. Her political shift led her to have a rapprochement with the Jewish bourgeoisie and with Jewish men in power. And she said, why aren't we studying the economic history of American Jews and their social mobility? So that's the way in which her politics informed what she thought historians should do. That is, they should look at, traders, and they should look at kinship networks between the South and the North, and they should look at credit societies and loan agreements. And of course, I have to say this, since it sounds very apologetic on my part, but she was prescient, because there's been an economic turn, right, in Jewish history where, foregrounding the Jewish innovation as entrepreneurs is something that historians take more seriously now in the American context. So in that regard, her political rapprochement with bourgeois Jewish life, her rejection of militancy and working class politics informed her agenda for writing Jewish history.
All right. Well, I really just want to take a moment to thank both of you for a fascinating conversation of the writing of modern Jewish history. And I think obviously there's so much more for us to learn, so much to discuss, both as you sort of talk about the through lines of, let's call it the politics of the writing of Jewish history, and also what it means for our present moment today, where we're still making an argument for history in some way. So I will encourage everyone who's here or who's watching this to order copies of both Conscious History and Polish Jewish Historians Before the Holocaust, and From Left to Right with this lovely cover on Lucy S. Davidovich, The New York Intellectuals and the Politics of Jewish History. I want to thank Dr. Sinkoff and Dr. Aleksiun for being here today and sharing your time and expertise with all of us. Thank you for a really fascinating, stimulating conversation. It's great to see both of you and everyone who's in the audience. Yes, a round of applause as we sort of in a Zoom format.
Thank you, Avi. Thank you, Nancy.
We wish everyone continued good health. Sei gesund und stark. Yeah, be well. I'll stop the recording. Thanks, everyone.
And now